Thanks for having me back, and thanks to all of you for coming. The topic, as you see, is how to land your dream job right out of grad school. I imagine a few of you are thinking about a job at this point. Is that right? I'd like to start with some questions. And the first one, so who's a researcher? That's probably everybody. Okay. My background is science, like Christy said. I tend to often work with scientists, but what I'm going to talk about today is valid for anybody, any kind of researcher. I tend to pick on the PhDs because we have some of the biggest challenges. I'll get to that. PhD myself. I'm curious, though, who is from like a science or technology background? I know it's Texas Tech. Okay. And then anybody who's not? I'm curious, what are the disciplines like? Design, okay. Like Christy? Healthcare, awesome. What else? Okay. Great. Awesome. Well, welcome, and I'm glad you came. Some of the examples and the stories will come from my own science background, just because that's where I've come from. But the kinds of things we're talking about, and specifically the steps for finding your own job, will apply to all of you. If you didn't get, there are handouts outside the room, or you can get one here. If you need a pen, there's one pen left up here. We've gone through them already. But if you need a handout, they're also out by the door on the way in. So, everybody here is a researcher. How about this? Who wants to work in industry? Okay, great. Nearly everybody. Is there anybody who's not sure, who's trying to decide? Okay, great. Totally fine that you came here. We'll talk about a number of things. We got 90 minutes. There's a lot we could talk about what industry is like. We'll cover some of that. Hopefully it will help you make a decision. Who wants an exciting career? Okay. How about if I ask the question this way? How many of you are confident that industry holds an exciting career for you? I always get fewer hands. Pretty good distribution. That's good. There are places where everybody puts their hand up. Yes, I want an exciting career. How many of you are confident you can find an exciting career in industry? And maybe there's still one hand up, right? That's understandable because a big part of the challenge you're faced with, for most of you, maybe all of you, has anyone worked in industry before in any capacity? Okay, one, couple, good, actually a few. So you have some idea what it's like. For most of us, the challenge is we're trying to decide between something we probably understand very well, academia, because we've spent so many years there, and something that we know nothing about, or some of you know some about, right? And that can be a hard challenge. So if you're feeling like I'm not sure, totally fair. When I was faced with this, so I just assumed for the first 5 years of my PhD that I would be a professor, just following the traditional path. And when in the last year I decided I didn't want to be a professor, I'll say more of that story later, my advisor, she was like, I really can't help you with that. If you want a postdoc, I can hook you up with a great lab. But if you want to go into industry, I know nothing about it. And we buy equipment from industry, and that's about all I know, right? So I was on my own. That's where this came from. So I'm going to help you with that. So if you're feeling that uncertainty, I get it. What I'm guessing is many of you have questions of some kind, right? And I've worked with PhDs, scientists, engineers, other researchers for a number of years. And one thing I find is they all have questions about moving to industry. And there are some obvious questions, perhaps, I say obvious, maybe more straightforward, like what will I do in industry? I know how to do research, but what will I do in industry? Do I have the right skills? Will I get bored? Is that one that you've heard in industry, that it's boring and monotonous work? Yeah, I never found that to be the case, but I know that that is out there. And then there's the overqualified. A PhD is overqualified for industry. Have you heard that? That's another, I consider it a myth. That comes from not aiming at the right job level for what you do, not understanding your skills, not understanding what you actually bring. But then there are other questions. So these are, I say, more obvious ones. And there are other questions that people have, and through talking to people one-on-one, I find them, but they tend to, I call them, these are kind of the quiet questions. They don't really show up in an interview, and sometimes, or in a career discussion. And a lot of times people are afraid to voice these. So I'm not going to make you voice them. I'm just going to walk through some of them, let these play, and you can just watch. Because I imagine many of you have had some of these. I remember feeling this one myself. This worried me. Has anyone had any of these questions? Yeah, so did I. So if you have any of these questions, if you've asked yourself even one of these, first of all, you are not alone, right? I saw lots of nods. And I can tell you, I had many of them myself. Now, I've loved my industry career, more than 25 years, if you heard it. I've never regretted the decision. I've really, really enjoyed it, found it intellectually stimulating, challenging, exciting. And when I was looking to move out into industry after my PhD, I had many of these questions too. So, you know, it's not a problem. It means you're taking it seriously. So considering a job outside of academia can feel like more than just finding a job. It can feel like maybe you're questioning your identity as a researcher or a scientist, or maybe not an engineer. That I think most engineers at least kind of have a vision of industry, perhaps. I mean, don't let me speak for you, but I know as a scientist, many of us feel like, well, it almost felt like, am I still going to be a scientist, or will I still be a researcher? Will I still be, you know, and that it can be challenging. So let's talk about where a PhD can actually belong, right? I'll just talk broadly about a PhD researcher. We know that we belong in academia or research, right? That's obvious. That's how we are groomed. That's how we receive our degree. But what about industry? Well, academia is about creating knowledge. We know we can do that as a PhD researcher. That's great. Industry creates solutions. So academia is about creating knowledge. Industry is about creating solutions. Well, most of you probably have solved a lot of problems. That's a big part, generally, of a PhD. I know certainly as a scientist it is. You can speak for your own specific research disciplines. So I actually say, you know, we belong in industry. It's not just that, well, it's plan B. I think that's a terrible idea. And after a couple of decades in industry, I don't believe that anymore at all. We belong in industry. There's a lot of things we can do, and here's where some of these are kind of aimed at science specifically, but not all of them. There are a lot of things that researchers can do. So I want to get beyond this idea that industry is somehow a secondary career path, because it absolutely is not. It just sometimes looks like that from within the academic world. The reality, most of us actually work in industry, and most of us love it. But few of us learn very much about it. There's still an idea that we should become professors. Now, Texas Tech, I've worked with enough people here. That's not really that's not the culture I see from the outside. I don't know if that's what you see in your lab, because you have your own PI, your own professors, people around you, but that can be a lot of the idea. You know, well, here's how I like to start with it. Does everybody believe most of us end up working in industry? Do you believe that that's the case? Or is there still a question? Okay, so let me walk you through this. I actually have a slide on this somewhere. There's no data, but just to drive the question. What percentage do you think actually go on to become professors? Anybody have a number in mind? 10. 10? Okay. I'm curious why you say 10. Any thoughts?
Oh.
That's just what...
I mean, I'll try to say it nicely. More PhDs get produced than there are positions.
Yeah, okay. That is absolutely true. So I look at this. So I'm a physicist. We do a lot of sophisticated mathematical calculations and all that, but something else we learn to do is a back-of-the-envelope approximation. And the whole idea is you can do the sophisticated math, but what if you make an error? Try and get an estimate, just, you know, back-of-the-envelope, simple calculation, take you 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, just to check and see if you were in the right ballpark. And so that's something I like to do. Well, there are a lot of studies out there about PhDs of different disciplines. There's a chart for biologists, and there's one that is specifically to the UK, and all these different numbers, and the numbers vary some, and I think that tends to make people think, well, maybe the jury's still out. So I look at it like this. I say, this is just a math problem, and you don't need to do any expensive studies to be in the right ballpark. Let me start with the question. First step, how many PhDs do you think a typical professor graduates, average? Could be for your discipline, could be overall. Any idea, ballpark? I know it varies quite a bit. Well, the numbers that I've heard are somewhere between 10 and 20. Does that sound feasible? Let's say 20. 20 is pretty good. I mean, some people say, some universities it's 50, or more, depending on the discipline. Let's say 20. So let's say a professor graduates 20 PhDs over their career. How many of those PhDs are required to replace them when they retire? One. Right there, you can kind of see the realization. It took me a while to think of this. The math is so simple. I didn't need calculus to come up with that. I didn't need statistics. I didn't need to do anything. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. So in a steady state, and I know things are changing, right? If tenure track positions are decreasing, if PhD production is going up, that makes it even a smaller number. But even in a steady state, you're talking 5%. And do I really need to know a decimal point on that? Or if it's 7% or 3%, look, the conclusion is the same, back to what I just mentioned. Oh, wrong way. Most of us work outside of academia, so that's 95%. Now some stay in other academic things, some go to national labs and all that, but we're talking 95% of us leave academia, do not become research professors, PIs like our advisors. Wow. That's the most relevant, important thing. So why are we training everybody to be researchers and not doing this? This is why I do what I do. Like I say, most of us love it, right? This isn't like, oh man, something is wrong and we have to go find something to do. There are exciting careers out there. There's just a disconnect because so many people who have spent their entire careers in academia don't really understand it. It's not their fault. That's just, that's where they've spent their careers. So few of us learn about it. So you can do this, you can make this transition. Many, many, many people have made the transition. It may seem scary. Hopefully what we talk about today makes it less so. But you can make the transition just like so many of us have. We all have different stories, but there are some common elements to it. Now let me tell you yours, coming from a science background anyway. But I think as researchers you might identify no matter what the discipline is. So I love science from the time I was a kid. I was curious about everything, asked a lot of questions, and it was cool to figure out that, hey, we humans have ways of figuring out how things work. I could say, how does this work? And usually there's an answer. And if there isn't, I could figure out how we're going about finding that. So I'm a physicist by training. This is a photo of me and my lab partner. We worked in a laser lab, and so that means the marketing people wanted to take photos of our lab because we had all the cool colors, right? So I got to be on the cover of the physics department catalog. And I worked in laser spectroscopy. I liked all kinds of science, and in fact, I wanted to be a doctor when I was young, but I realized that in physics, you don't have to memorize nearly as much as you do in biology or in chemistry. What was I heard just this morning? Somebody was saying that an introductory biology textbook has more vocabulary than a language textbook, and I thought, boy, I would believe it. But in the first day of my physics class, my professor said, we'll talk about a lot of formulas in this workshop, in this class, this semester, but you really only have to remember one, and that's F equals ma, and you can derive everything else from that. And I thought, I'm in the right place. I don't want to have to memorize a bunch of things. So in laser spectroscopy, we were doing a lot of quantum mechanical effects and figuring some things out. There were some cool effects pushing atoms around with laser light, because it turns out there's momentum, even though a photon has no mass, right? And it was all really pretty cool. The project that I did for my dissertation is to build an atom interferometer to demonstrate the interference of matter waves, like, to interfere as waves do, and it actually worked. I saw these fringes. It was so cool when that worked. I felt I was a pure academic. I loved learning about the new science. I loved working in the lab. I loved this excitement of discovery. The specific science, the specific technology doesn't really matter for the story. The point is I really enjoyed that discovery and learning about new things, right? As I imagine many of you can identify with that. Now, I didn't really know who would use the work that I did. I didn't really know who was going to read my papers. Sometimes it feels like you're writing for a dozen people in the world who really care about your niche. But that's okay. But as I got further along, I ran into another problem. I realized after about 5 years of watching my advisor and the other professors in my department, that's not really the career that I want. I didn't want to be a professor after all, like I imagined I did, right? It's great for a lot of people, nothing against it. very supportive of academic careers. It's just I decided that wasn't for me. So what would I do? Well, my lab partner, Roger, the other guy in the photo, he had actually done an internship before coming to grad school, and he talked about this great world of industry. In an industry, you make things people need. So turning science into things people need. This was the title of the first book I wrote back in 2010 is when it came out. And the title of my company, Turning Science, comes from this, because that's what we do in industry, right? We turn research, we turn science into things people need. And he described this world of industry, whether it's a technical company or not. You're doing things, you send them to people, a service, a product. If they like it, they buy more. Your boss is happy. You make money. Sounds really good. So I decided, okay, I will go into an industry. That sounds like the career step for me. But then I ran into another problem. I didn't know anything about it, right? Like I said, my advisor said, sorry, but you're on your own. I'd love to help you, but I don't know anything about it. So what was I going to do? Well, I got out and talked to people. You have to do that. Don't be fooled by the online application game. I know it feels like the obvious way to look for a job. We'll come back to that. You have to get out and talk to people. And early on, I was talking to any kind of tech company that I could think of, right? I even visited Hewlett-Packard. They were making printers, thinking this has nothing to do with my technology, but I'm trying to figure out how do I work for a company and what would I do? And eventually, I figured out how to find companies that might need what I bring, how to talk to people in industry, because it's different than talking to people at an academic conference. How to describe my value, that's definitely different. How do I help them see that I'm a researcher? There are stereotypes about PhDs. In industry, they're based on some truth, usually from bringing academic mindsets into industry. So how do I describe that I can bring them practical value? And most of all, how do I get that first job? Which I did at a company that made lasers for scientific instrumentation. That was, we'll talk about targets in a minute, but that's what I decided would be my target. And that worked. And that was pretty exciting. From there, my industry career took off. I've worked at 4 different companies, doing a variety of different things, starting with technology development, but then ending up with very customer-facing roles that didn't necessarily require technical skills at all, but working with customers in a business development and product management environment. And through all of that, I learned a lot about how companies work, where a PhD can fit into a company organization, and what it takes to be successful in industry. And that last one is probably the most important one, because I think that's the part we struggle with the most coming out of an academic research environment. We're trained in a certain mindset, and we make that transition. It can be a challenge to make that adaptation. My wife is a PhD psychologist. She does leadership education, working with company leaders. Something she says is the lessons we learn early, we learn well. And I love that phrase. I think, wow, I think back to my time as a PhD. You're learning how to work. When you get a bachelor's, you're just learning book knowledge. If you go out and get a job then, everybody knows you don't know anything. You just, your book knowledge, but you don't understand how companies work. But getting your PhD, you learn to be an academic researcher. You learn to work. And I remember developing these thinking and working habits that were great in academic research, but you have to modify them when you go into industry, and that can be one of the challenges. So this was so important, I started my own company. I've written 3 books now on being a scientist in industry specifically. They'd be applicable to any kind of researcher, like the stuff we'll talk about here today. Point is, you can get an awesome industry job directly out of grad school. That can be done. Lots of people do it. There's a lot of things we're going to talk about. We'll go through specific 5 steps in a minute, but I want to start with what I consider the most important thing to remember. Like, if you remember one thing when you leave, it's that in industry, success is a game, not a formula. This is a reminder that I found to be so valuable, I made it the title of my second book. It's a game, not a formula. And so I want to talk about what that means, because like I say, this is a theme I come back to so often. Let me talk about formula thinking, which is what we learn in an academic mindset. Frankly, we learn it when we're kids. We go off to school, and they give you a test, and you learn that, hey, if I answer all the questions correctly, I get an A or a 1 or whatever the grading system was where you grew up. Point is, you pass the test, your teacher's happy, your parents are happy, and you learn very quickly, this is a game about having the right answers. There is a right answer out there, and I can figure it out, or I can learn it. And that goes all the way up into university when they say, here's a list of courses. And if you pass all these classes, we'll give you a degree in a specific discipline. It's still checklist, formula, recipe, however you want to think about it, right? And of course, as researchers, that's really what we're trying to do, is to learn something new, to find a right answer. It's a right answer because we can publish it. We can stand behind it, right? We're trying to find something that is verifiable, that we get rid of any uncertainties. As a physicist, the classic is the block sliding down the inclined plane, right? You get rid of friction, you ignore all these things, but then we have a predictable formula. The point is, it's still looking for a right answer, and there's real value in that. It takes skill, it takes a lot of things that we learn. You have to be fairly smart, and that's great, and that's really awesome. But when you move out of a research lab, whatever research you're doing, it changes, and it's more like a game. And when I say it's like a game, there's a few reasons. The first is there's really no longer a right way to do things. It's easy for us to get it, that there's lessons we learn early, right, and think, what's the right way to do this? I get questions like that a lot. If I want a job being such and such, what should I do? Are there certifications, courses I should take? I can see they kind of have a checklist in mind. How do I make sure that it happens? There is no way, right? There's no right way. You've got enough training and skills. The point now is to get out there and just figure out how to play the game, how to win the game with what you have. To use the analogy, so soccer or football, I work internationally, so trying to find a sport that works for everybody. Most people know football, soccer. But whatever your professional, if you have any professional sports that are your favorite, think of the 3 best teams in that sport. And then think of the coaches for those teams. Do they coach their teams in exactly the same way? No, not at all, right? And yet they're playing the same game on the same field with the same rules, but they have different strengths in their team, they have different experiences, they have different strategies that they believe are best for them. It's their way of going out and winning the game. And yet other people find a different way. So there's no single right way. The key to success in finding a job and doing well at that job is to stop looking for the right way and find a way. There's probably lots of ways. This is what industry is about at its core. We're not trying to find something we can publish and stand behind for the rest of our careers, for the rest of humanity. That's what we hope to do with our research. We publish something and that's good forever. Industry is trying to solve problems, and there's probably many ways to solve problems. And the goal is just to find one based on the strengths you have in your company and do it as quickly as possible. So that's really what it's, there's no single right way. That's the first way. It's like a game. Second is winners have to take risks. Let's go back to soccer or football. Well, so as a physicist, every physicist would love to calculate a formula for reliably kicking a goal, right? Given a certain set of conditions, and we could probably do that. But that's not how you win the game. You win the game by seeing an opportunity and taking a chance, taking a shot. And you might make it and you might miss. You're not going to die. If you miss, you try again, and you learn and you get better at it. That's really the way most things are in your career. And we get used to, sure, in research we may try things that may not work out, but we can generally do that in the privacy of our lab or our research or our computer or whatever. We don't usually have to speak about it. But in industry, you start having to make recommendations for your team or your manager when you don't know the right answer. That is a risk. It's like taking a shot. Something we're not so used to. We get used to, with my intelligence and the skills I've learned, I can find the right answer and stand up and say, yes, I'm confident in this. But the game has changed. The third way, it's like a game. We hear knowledge is power, but that's not really true. Knowledge is only power when you do something with it, right? You have to take some kind of action, and action is where the risk and the no right way is. So to go back to the game analogy, I think we all know that knowing the rules of the game better than anyone else doesn't really make you an awesome player, right? That's how you become a ref, a referee. So do you want to be a referee or do you want to score points? So I'll keep coming back to this. It's a game, not a formula, because it's a great reminder that I use still, because these habits can be hard to break, right? I still remind myself it's a game. There's no right way. Figure out how to win with the strengths you have. Be willing to take a risk. But what I really want to do today is share 5 steps for landing your first job out of grad school. And I like to tell stories. You've probably seen that already. I've collected a lot of them. Stories have a lot of power, so that's what I want to do today. The first step, determine your strengths. This is what all starts with. Figure out what you're good at and what you're not good at. And I like to think of these in terms of technical strengths, which would be related to your discipline. It's not technology per se, but things that you're probably aware of in the research you're doing, right? If you work in a lab, maybe they're related to lab skills or your technical understanding, actual technical understanding. But whatever it is, it's probably the things related to your discipline. But there are also non-technical, I call them non-technical strengths, that are less function or less needed for your research. But when you move out into an industry job, there's a lot you'll be doing that isn't strictly technical, related to your discipline. Could be working with other people, could be a lot of different things. So I'll come back to this, but I just want to point out there's the things that you might be aware of as your strengths right now, and there's things that you might not be so aware of that are actually very important. So when we talk about strengths, I like to use these three categories: skills, knowledge, and talents or attributes. And these aren't my ideas. This book, First Break All the Rules by Marcus Buckingham and Kurt Kaufman, these guys work for the Gallup Institute, and so they work with data. They set out to figure out what do good managers do well. And maybe by looking at a lot of data, we can identify things they do well. And one of the things they looked at was hiring. And an important aspect of hiring is how do you look at the strengths of the candidates you're considering. And so they propose these three sections, and I like them. So I like to use them. This last one, I'll mention talents and attributes. The book says talents. They use this word. I prefer attributes because talent sounds like it's always positive, whereas attributes, just things about you that sometimes may work for you, sometimes may work against you, depending on the situation. But these are often these non-technical strengths that I talk about. Again, I'll come back to that. What are skills? Skills are things that you practice. The more you do them, the better you are at them. And so it could be things like solving complex integrals, it could be using Microsoft Excel, it could be flying a plane. The point is, the more you do them, you get better. That's what a skill is. Contrast that with knowledge, that's just something you're aware of. And the book suggests two categories of knowledge, which I like. There's factual knowledge, things that could be taught or in a book. And then there's experiential knowledge, which you just kind of have to learn on your own. So sometimes I give some examples. If you say the rules of calculus, well, that's factual knowledge, right? Because there's a book and it has those rules. If I say how to give a patient bad news, let's suppose you're in medicine, and say how to give a patient bad news. Well, I'm told there are books that give you guidelines, but I think most people who actually do it, when I work with, people who are going to be doctors, they say, yeah, that's just something you kind of have to figure out what works for you, because some of it is how it fits with your personality, right? What works for somebody else may not work for you. That's experiential knowledge. Then I talk about something like aligning a complex instrument. We might say, well, there's probably a user's manual that says do it in these steps, but any grad student who's actually worked with that instrument knows that, yeah, that's a starting point, but you can get 20% better performance out of it with this thing I figured out. That's experiential. So this starts to get at why these two are valuable. Factual knowledge is fine. I see people, sometimes in their resume, they'll list courses they've taken. Well, that's fine. That is stuff you know, but anybody else who took those courses can also claim that knowledge. So it's not really that great at making you unique or stand out. But if you describe something you did over and above and there's some experiential knowledge, yeah, their manual says this, but I found after working with it for 3 years that here's a way to get it to work even better. That's an initiative you took, that's something you have that stands out. So, finding a job, part of it is showing how you are unique compared to anyone else who was there. Think about experiential knowledge. What have you done? What have you invested in that might actually help? And that brings us to attributes. Attributes, or you might say talents, these are how you function. People might say how you are wired. And we say wired because, well, they really can't be learned, tend to remain stable over a person's life. All right, these are just kind of who you are as a person. These, more than anything, make you unique. Because you may have the same skills and knowledge as other people in your department, but you probably are still unique as a person. You have things that are important to you, the way you think, how you work with other people. So from there, let's talk about types of attributes. So again, the book, First Break All the Rules, offers these categories, and I like them, so I stick with them. The first set of attributes are striving attributes. What motivates you? Why do you do what you do? Second are thinking. These are, my pointer's bouncing here. thinking, how you weigh alternatives, how you make decisions. And then the third is relating, how you relate to other people. Who do you trust, confront, ignore, build relationships with? If you think about yourself relative to, could be your friends, could be your family, could be the people you work with, you probably differ in these ways. And maybe compare it to the people you work with. You may have the same skills and knowledge or a lot of overlap, but you probably are more unique in terms of what motivates you, what you care about, how you think about things, and how you work with other people. Right? I mean, if you're introverted, that is how you relate to other people. Some ways that's positive, other times it may be a challenge. We often develop skills to help us adapt with our attributes, right? So, I'm actually an introverted person. I'm naturally shy, and yet I'm up here doing this. You say, wow, how does that happen? Well, I've developed skills over my career to adapt to who I am. But these are really important principles about your strengths. And I'll ask the question, if we look at skills, knowledge, and attributes, which of these strengths do you think are on your resume if you have one, or if you haven't built one yet? What do you think are the easiest, what appear mostly on resumes, CVs?
Knowledge.
Yeah, skills and knowledge is what I find, both. Those are pretty easy to describe. It's easy to think in terms of bullet points. And if you think of a job description, which has its own challenges, that is far from a perfect tool for finding a job, tends to be descriptions in paragraphs, bullet points, things like that. Skills and knowledge are easy to describe, and they tend to be the easiest to put on your CV, but they tend not to be the most important stuff. And so I'll tell a story from, so the work I do with Turning Science, most of it is giving these workshops. I travel actually around the world and give workshops mostly at universities, but I also, some of the time when somebody in my network asks for help, sometimes I'll do consultant work with companies, just because that's what I've done most of my career and it's fun. A while ago, I was working with a laser company in Arizona, and I had an opportunity, this was only a few years ago, so I was doing these workshops talking about skills and knowledge and attributes, and I had an opportunity to work with two project managers at this company. They had both just been hired to the company, they were brand new. They were both about 10 to 15 years into their career. So the point is, they were experienced, they had the skills and the knowledge of project managers. Both of them did, right? They could build a schedule, a Gantt chart, the style that you see here. They could take meeting minutes. They understood the software, the budgeting software, things like that the company used. They had the skills and the knowledge. But I realized very quickly working with them, they were very different people to work with. They were different as project managers. One was really good at being proactive. He was motivated. This is a striving attribute. He was motivated to be proactive and anticipate things that might go wrong and take actions to prevent them. You really want that in a project manager, right? The other one just had a habit of letting things go wrong and then blaming someone else for them. And there were other differences, but I realized very quickly, oh wow, yes, I knew this, but it was a reminder, especially since I'd been talking about strengths, how skills and knowledge are not enough. Yeah, those are the basic things, those are kind of need to have, but their attributes, what motivated them, how they thought, how they related to other people, that actually is far more important. And in fact, I'll tell another story. So I interviewed her for this book, but the full interview is in my third book, Shaping the World, a woman named Yasmin Saudagar. She's actually a physicist by training, but she started a life sciences company in Toronto, imaging neurons in vivo in live mice. So go figure. But she was talking to me about the hiring process for her startup. And she says, a lot of job seekers imagine that it's easy for me to find a perfect fit for everything I would like to have in an employee. And one of the things that means is they kind of feel like if they don't think they're a perfect fit, they don't even bother talking to me or applying. But I rarely, if ever, find somebody who's a perfect fit. Because there's all kinds of things I'd like to have. Of course, there's skills. I'd like them to understand the processes that we'd use and really understand the science we work with. There's knowledge. But as a small company in particular, it's always important. The culture fit is really important. Culture fit is the word she used, but that's really, are they motivated by the things that we're motivated by? Do they think in ways we need to solve these problems? Do they relate to the other people on the team? Those are attributes we talked about, right? She said the culture fit is very important also. And I never find somebody that's all of that. I said, well, that's really interesting. So if you can't find a perfect fit, what do you do? How do you decide who you hire? And she said, I always go for those attributes. I always go for culture fit first. Because if there's something they don't know, knowledge or skills, if I think they're a great fit for the company, I'm willing to work with them for a few months to teach them. And if they're a PhD scientist, I know they're going to learn quickly. 3 years ago, they didn't know half of what they know now. That will end up with a far better team member. Whereas if I hire too quickly and I get somebody because they have the right skills and knowledge, but they don't fit the team, that doesn't work for anybody, right? That's a waste of a lot of time. I mean, I have to let them go. It's bad for me. It's bad for them. So I always focus on attributes, on culture fit. So that's really why I like to accentuate those different things. And as I mentioned, attributes, they're often non-technical, but they're very important. Hopefully I've made the case for they are important. I encourage you to think about what your non-technical strengths might be. I teach a 2-day version of my How to Be More Employable workshop where we actually dig into this deeply and talk about some non-technical strengths as well as your technical strengths. We won't do that today, we just have the 90 minutes. But I put in your handout, and if anyone didn't get a handout, there's a couple up here and there's some by the door. There is a worksheet in here on, let's see, where is it? It's actually the second page in. Determine your strengths. I do encourage you to spend some time with this after the workshop and thinking through what are your skills, what are your knowledge, what's the knowledge you have, both factual and experiential, and also your attributes, those non-technical strengths, what you're motivated by, how you think, how you make decisions, how you work with other people. Because it is a really important part. If you want to find a job that fits you, it's not just about finding one quickly. You want to find one where there's a good fit. So it's important to start by understanding what you want. And I'll give you some examples here. Now again, I'm, as a physicist, background in laser spectroscopy, these won't apply to you, of course, but what I'd like to do is illustrate how these might look. So if I were to say, well, what are my skills? Hardware prototyping, putting things together, assembling devices. I've worked in hard tech most of my life, right? And that could be things like I learned to work in the machine shop as a grad student and actually build things. Assembly and test. With practice, I got better at all of this, right? Laser alignment. Aligning, you've got a complex system with a lot of mirrors. It takes some skill to figure out how to align that and make it work. That's something that I could do, right? Spectroscopy, set up, align, and test. All of these things with practice, I got better at it. This is one of the reasons that I had multiple projects before I had my dissertation project. My advisor said, well, assuming an academic career path, you're not in any hurry anyway. We'll get you a project, you'll learn the techniques and get practice, and then another project, and then we'll get you something you'll do for your dissertation. But these are things that I practiced. Then we could talk about knowledge, which is a little different. Well, there's the laser science, things like population inversion, stimulated emission, what's the physics behind a laser? That's knowledge, right? You can learn them. The laser technology, not how to align a laser, but gain media, pumping technologies, the details that you can find in a book, precision measurement, methodologies, calculations, useful techniques, best practices. And when it comes to best practices, here's something, some of it might be factual, some of it I probably learned on my own. It's experiential, right? So this is what knowledge might look like. But then if we go to attributes, these might sound quite different. I love to know how things work. Okay, I mean, that may seem obvious for somebody who became a scientist, but it's an important thing to think about. Not everybody is that way. And when I head out into industry, I'm going to be working with people from a whole broad spectrum of areas. And I need to find a spot to fit in where I bring value. That's something that might actually be useful. I enjoy seeing the big picture. Sometimes people think, well, how is that relevant? Well, working with devices, what I have found is there's the detailed work where an electrical engineer or a mechanical engineer needs to figure out how to design the perfect part for this, but somebody has to see how it all goes together to make an instrument and that it provides the outputs that the customer wants at that top level. I enjoy that. Not everybody does, but that's actually what I wanted to do. I like seeing that big picture and working that way. One scientist that I interviewed said it's kind of like wanting to be the conductor of an orchestra rather than first chair violin. Wow, that's a great example. Some people, they want to be the best violin player ever. Others say, I understand several of the instruments, but I'd like to bring together the whole piece of music. Wow, I can identify with that. That's an attribute of mine. That's a striving attribute. I care about that, so I do a good job at it. I enjoy seeing others succeed. One of the scientists I interviewed for my third book, my last book, Shaping the World, Cather Simpson, she's a professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She was describing what she calls, it's a basketball analogy, she's actually an American even though she's down in New Zealand, point guard leadership. Now, I'm not much of a sports fan, but she described point guard in basketball as the one who dribbles the ball down the court, but then generally will pass it to someone else to actually shoot a goal. She said, I'm okay with that. To do well in that job, you have to be excited about setting somebody else up to succeed, but not necessarily making the goal yourself. And she said, that's what I do as a professor, for example, because I set all my students up to succeed, and they go off and do amazing things, and I'm okay with that. I like that. That really makes me feel good. And I thought, I enjoy that too. I hadn't appreciated that because I don't play basketball, but I also have that same appreciation. And I find as a manager, that can be really great. You hear stories of managers who try to steal the success for themselves and say they did it. I've never felt that problem at all. I have no problem saying on my team, yep, so-and-so did this. Hopefully I set him up for that. I can feel good that I enabled it, but I'm fine with that. Truth and sound logic are very important to me. This has become more true in the last several years than ever, I guess. As a scientist, I like to say that that's a thing, but I realize, no, this is really important. And I can think back over my career to points where that was really important. Whatever we were doing, I cared that integrity was a part of it, that what we say this thing does, it actually does, that we're not, fudging anything or cutting any corners. I imagine how things might be. The kind of forward-looking aspects of a company where we think, well, what could we do with this? Whether it's business development or elements of product management, that's something that I'm excited by, and so I do well at it. So anyway, my hope with this is to help you see, well, what could attributes be? You can see there's nothing technical about this. If you think of me as a physicist, these have nothing to do with physics, not necessarily anything that I would have appreciated when I was working in a lab, and yet these can all be very relevant to helping me find a job that fits me well. Because if I'm looking for a job, we'll talk about a target in a minute, if I make sure it aligns with what I do well and what I want to do, I'm going to do a better job in the job, but I'll also do a better job convincing somebody I'm the right person for the job, which is a really important aspect of it. So let's stop here. So there are your personal strengths that we talked about. But also, I like to think about what are the unique strengths that a PhD researcher might have. And I realize we have a range of disciplines in here, but I'll bet there's some common elements that we can talk about. I'm curious from you. Here's the reason I say this. It's one thing to think of your personal strengths, but when it comes to the strengths that people in your discipline have, it can be easy to lose sight of those in an academic setting because everyone around you might have a lot of the same strengths, and so you kind of forget that it makes you unique. But when you leave an academic setting to go look for a job in industry, all of a sudden, you may appear very different because of these strengths that you might not really even think about much right now. So what do you think those strengths are? I've got a list, but I will start with, what do you guys think? What makes a PhD researcher?
Resilience.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one, because you probably had to struggle with an awful lot and keep going. Well, so there's resilience and there's persistence. They're related but not exactly the same, right? Dealing with problems, recovering from it, or continuing to move on. That's the persistent side. Yeah, that's a good one.
Curiosity.
Curiosity. I like curiosity. Not everybody has a curiosity, right? Did many of you, were you told as a kid that you were curious? To me, I was, and to me it just seemed like, well, yeah, isn't everybody? No, it turns out they're not. Okay, keep that in mind. That's a useful thing. And like most things, they have to be tempered a bit. This is part of coming out. In academia, curiosity is always great because anything new might be publishable. In industry, it's great to a point, but we do have to get products out the door. So you have to know when to turn it off and focus on the results and when to turn it on. But it's a really valuable strength. Persistence is the same way. Your advisor may let you bang your head against the wall 6 months while you figure something out. Your industry manager is going to want you to go find somebody who can help you. But the independence is good. So what else? What else do you think we're good at?
Creativity.
Yeah.
Finding new ways to do stuff.
Good. Yeah, you probably needed some creativity to get to the results of your experiment, right? Or whatever your research project was.
Maybe discerning the strength of a conclusion.
Wow, I like that. Nobody's ever said that before. That's a really good one. Because it's one thing to come to a conclusion. It's another to know what is the strength of that.
Yeah, how much effort and how much do you really know about your premises? And like if you're making a research claim, you know whether or not you have answered all of the points underneath your answer to your research question.
That's great, and I like that. And what that description makes me think of is in industry, we won't go through that here, but in the longer workshop, we talk about the differences. Certainty is important in academia. Before you make a claim that you're going to publish, you want to have that pretty well locked down. In industry, you have to move forward before you know without certainty. And it maybe by the time we're shipping it to a customer, we'll have done a lot of work to make sure that it does what we say it does, but decisions have to be made at much earlier steps. So it may become a game then of, hey, we don't know for sure, but are we 80%? Are we 30%? We're taking a risk. And so understanding that could be a big part of it. Your manager may say, what's the risk? We don't know for sure. Help us understand what we know and what we don't know. And then the next step is, what's risk mitigation on what we don't know? That's I like that. Thanks for bringing that up. What else? Okay, collaboration can be. Now that's a really interesting one because I generally say academia is kind of an individual pursuit, right? Your PhD is yours and nobody else is going to stand up with you to defend it. And some people, I have a quote from a guy who said, grad school kind of taught me the opposite of the real world. It taught me to work alone. But more and more academic projects are collaborative than ever, and that is really great. So if you did learn some things like that, that's actually something to highlight. And when we talk about stories, if you can tell stories about how you worked with other people, that will be great. Because one of the stereotypes of PhDs in industry is we have to do everything ourselves, we have to know all the answers ourselves. So talking about how you did work with somebody else is awesome. That's really good. How about problem solvers? We're pretty good at solving problems. Now, as a physicist, of course, mathematical problems is one thing we do, but any research project, chances are you had a plan and something didn't go the way you expected and you had to figure out how to get through that. It might be part of the resilience too, right, is bouncing back from that. We tend to be independent learners, right? That is kind of the hallmark of a PhD, is that you can get out there and learn on your own. I remember when I made that transition and I decided I don't want to take any more semester-long classes. That's kind of the way you go through university is sort of you learn all this stuff and then you go out and figure out what the problems are. At some point I switched and I said, okay, give me the problems and I'll go learn what I need to know. And maybe I want to take a workshop or a Coursera or something to, because now I know I need it, but I didn't want to just learn and then go find the problems. I can figure it out on my own, and not everybody's that way. We're analytical, tend to be really analytical, data-driven usually, normally. One of the entrepreneurs I mentioned, she started a life sciences company. She graduated from Harvard and started a life sciences company there in Boston. She said, one of the things I like about my research background is I'm very data-driven, and that helps me as an entrepreneur because I'm used to using data to make decisions. And she said, but one of the challenges of being an entrepreneur with a research background is I'd like every decision to be data-driven. And there are a lot of decisions that don't have a right answer, and I can't rely on the data. So I have to balance those two. I thought that was interesting. If you're in technology anyway, probably have a broad technical knowledge, and that might be true whatever your discipline. It depends. So, maybe this is a strength, maybe it's not. Some of us feel like we get very niche focused, but others of us realize that in getting through to the end of our PhD project, whatever that is, there's a lot of things we have to learn along the way, and that can be a real advantage. You might have hands-on technical skills, depending on what you did, what you worked on. If you worked in a lab of some kind, that's important to remember. Because there's a lot of people in business that never actually did anything, right? Prone to challenging assumptions. Kind of goes with curiosity, but it's a little bit different. I've actually found this. It can be, even among technical people in the areas where I work, there's a lot of people that were taught to design things, but not really challenge the assumptions, not really, solve problems or figure things out. And I have seen opportunities where my tendency to be skeptical, not cynical, skeptics question facts, cynics question motives. So questioning facts, like, are we really sure that's true? And I found problems where other people had just assumed they trusted what they put into the algorithm and what came out of it. this is a much higher risk now that we've got AI, right? Do we trust what it tells us? I've always had that skeptical bit, wanted to challenge it and do a back of the envelope calculation or something to see if that makes sense. And then the unexplained is not scary but interesting. Who was it that mentioned this to me? Ashok Balakrishnan is one of the scientists I interviewed for my latest books. But he said, a lot of people don't like uncertainty or unexplained things. That's just kind of the nature of the human being. But I figure, diving into my PhD as a scientist anyway, that's what I chose for a career. I'm okay with the unexplained. And that gives me a certain strength. When something goes wrong, yeah, nobody's happy, but there's part of me that thinks, okay, I can dig in and learn a little bit more about it now. So hopefully this illustrates a range, a spectrum of strengths that maybe you didn't appreciate you had, because it might be that everybody around you here in your research setting has similar strengths. But when you leave an academic setting, you'll find these things make you pretty unique. So it's good to understand what those are. And then a really common thought that a lot of people have, PhDs in particular, you might be thinking about all that knowledge that you learned about. Right? I mentioned, papers, who actually reads the paper. Some people think, I know a whole lot about stuff that maybe a dozen people in the world care about. I spent 4 years learning all this stuff. Is that really going to help me get a job? And it may be that it won't. You might get lucky and find, some people, they find a job in the area that really is close to what they did for research. That's fine, but a lot of us end up doing something else. That doesn't mean the knowledge is wasted, or a better way to put it is the knowledge itself isn't really what the strength is. It's how you got to that knowledge. It's the skills and the attributes that allowed you to get to where you learned all that. So I like to say a PhD project, I could describe, some people will describe this very narrow thing that they've studied for the last 4 years. That's one way to describe it. And if you think of that as the benefit, it might feel like, how does that help you get an industry job? But a different way to think about it is to say, I was given a problem to solve. Nobody in the world had ever known this, right? This is unusual. Most stuff you learn in school and university, somebody knows the answer, it's just not me, and you go find it out. But that's not what you're doing. It's something nobody's ever done before. So I had to devise a plan on my own, or maybe with help from an advisor, but there was no book to look in. Outline a plan, I started marching down the way, had milestones along the way. At some point, something went wrong and I had to figure out how to solve it. And no one could really help me because nobody had solved this before. And I had to be persistent and resilient in the face of change and show a curiosity. And in the end, I got to the end and I demonstrated something nobody had ever demonstrated before. Well, notice I didn't mention the discipline at all, whether it was science or design or whatever. I didn't even mention the discipline. And yet there's a whole lot of value in that. So it's all a matter of what you think of as your strengths. It's not the knowledge, capabilities, the things you can do. How could you learn something again? Right? 3 years ago, you probably knew half or less of what you know now. Could you do that again in a different context? That's the real value. All right, so I spent a lot of time talking about the very first step because it's pretty important. Second one, define your target. What do you want to do and where do you want to do it? It can be really tempting when you're looking for a job to say, oh, I'm open to anything. I hear that sometimes. What do you want to do for your first job? Oh, I'm open to anything. And I always go, ooh. I understand the temptation. I know it's really tempting. Sometimes it's like, look, I need a job. I'll do anything. I get it. But I really suggest you focus your search. And there are 3 main reasons. One, you really can't do everything well, right? It may seem like, and I'm sure you're very qualified in a range of skills. That's great. That's awesome. But you can't do everything well, and you don't want to do everything well. So that's the first step that narrows you. Industry managers want to see focus. And I don't mean you need to be a specialist. If you think in terms of specialist or generalist or I person, T person, all this, it's not that. It's more, why are you there at that company? If you're open to anything, well, let me flip it a bit and then put yourself in the role of a hiring manager. And let's say you're talking to 2 candidates and you say, well, why are you interested in coming to work here at this company? And the first one says, oh, I'm open to anything, and I saw a job description and I thought, this could be okay, and I'll go learn more about that. Fine. But if the other candidate says, I'm really excited by the developments you're trying to get out into the world, solve this important problem, this is something that's been on my mind a while, here's some things I think I can bring to the team, I'd be really excited to be part of this. all else being equal, that I'd prefer to hire the second person because they know why they're here. They're excited to come in and do it. They'll probably do a better job. They're not going to decide 6 months down the road, yeah, I thought this would be good, but maybe no, I'm going to move on to something else. So they'd like to see focus. A breadth of skills is awesome. Just what do you want to do? But most importantly, focus allows you to take action. And that's the most important thing. You can research this market, whatever your target is. You can identify specific companies and people, and you can figure out how you can help them. And this is an important part of it. We get used to thinking in terms of just kind of our facts, our degree, the discipline, the project we worked on, the tools we worked with, but that's not really what you can do for the company. They will connect with you and want to hire you if you can help them see that. And they may connect the dots on their own, but probably not. And if you're open to anything, well, it's pretty hard to know how you could help. You can't do much work. You're going to have to think last minute when you see a job description and you go in for an interview to talk to them about what you do. So that's why it's really important to target. And we'll keep digging into this, but let me pause for a minute. Some people say, great, you've convinced me a target's important, but how do I build a target? Well, first step, I'd say start with something you're excited about or you're interested in. This could be a market, could be a technology, could be an application, could be whatever, right? Maybe you really enjoy nanotechnology. Maybe you want to do something in sustainable energy because of how important it is. Maybe there's a disease that took a family member and you know what? I want to be part of the team that finally finds a solution to this. Whatever it is, if you're motivated and you're interested, you'll do a far better job researching it and you'll do a far better job convincing people you are the right person. Then think about geography. Chances are there's places you want to live and places you don't want to live. So that can lead you to specific companies that are in that area. Some people want to move back home closer to family. Some people want to stay where they are. Some people think, hey, now's a good opportunity to go abroad and live in another country. Whatever it is, but that can guide you to specific companies. And then, of course, we talked about strengths that can lead you to specific jobs within that company or those companies. So here's where your research skills pay off. You're all researchers, so of course you can research companies online. Find people through LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a great tool. Don't think that if you just create a profile, recruiters will come along and find you. That happens sometimes, but it's a tool. LinkedIn is a tool, and if you want it to work for you, you have to use it properly. The research through that, finding people there through if you have a target, you can find keywords related to your target. Put those keywords in, you'll find people, companies, groups, see what they're posting. You can learn a lot about your target area by seeing what is posted on LinkedIn. Trade magazines. These are not journals. Does anybody know what a trade magazine is? These are really very different than where you would publish your research, peer-reviewed journals. These are more like advertisements for the company. So in my area, lasers, there are two of them, Laser Focus World and Photonic Spectra. So first of all, these have lots of ads. Companies can put ads for their companies in them. That's how they support the magazine. I mean, I think you can still get them in print, but there's, of course, websites. But the articles that are in these are not on research. They are more the company's ways of talking about the new developments that they're coming out with. It's their way of describing how they are staying relevant in their market, relative to competitors. It may be for investors, it could be for customers, but it's their way of saying, here's what we're doing that's special. That's great for PhD researchers because that's where they need smart PhDs, the new developments they're coming out with. So let me show you how this happened in my case. So I was looking for a job. I needed a target. I decided out of all the things I worked with, the lasers that were part of the tools, that was what I would, there were companies that produced these these instruments as scientific instrumentation. From a geography standpoint, there were a lot of them that were all clustered in the San Francisco Bay Area. I thought, okay, that works well because if I get a job with one and 5 years down the road I want to change jobs, maybe I don't even have to move. And with that concentration, maybe that's just a great way to build a career. So that was my target. So all of a sudden I started reading everything I could on my target companies. One day I was reading Laser Focus World and there was an article by a company called SDL that was talking about how they were developing the next generation of the kinds of lasers I used as a grad student. But they were going to build it, instead of these complex things, a big instrument like this with 5 mirrors and an organic dye, for the gain medium and all this, they were going to make them out of semiconductor lasers, much more compact, much more stable. And I thought, oh, wow, the headaches I dealt with as a grad student, I would love to be part of the team that develops these better, more compact, more efficient, cheaper solutions. That would be so awesome to be part of that team. So all of a sudden, I could start to imagine, how could I help them do that? Why would they hire me? What do I have that I could bring to that team? That was one big benefit that, before I read the article, I had no idea. All of a sudden, it was this eureka moment. The other thing that was really valuable was that they mentioned in there they were collaborating with a scientist at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and I recognized his name. I went to my advisor and I said, "Didn't you postdoc with Leo?" She said, "Yeah, I'll introduce him to you." And I was, well, that would be awesome. And he said, "Well, hey, if you're a SUAS student, I'm sure, you're pretty good. I'd be happy to introduce you to the guy who wrote this article out there in California." And all of a sudden, I had somebody who was willing to take my phone call at this target company. I mean, that was like all within the space of reading this article. And that ultimately led to my first job. You don't know until you start reading, you can't do that with all the companies in the world. But when you narrow, you can start to figure out, what is it I'm excited about doing? What can I bring to the table? And who knows who you might find that could connect you through to that. You just can't do that research on a grand scale, like when you target. And then the last thing is you can meet people and ask about their work. This is what I call informational interviews. Informational, or some people call them expert interviews, this is a great way to learn about your target. Get out and talk to people. And there's a worksheet on this one as well in there. We won't do it in this workshop, but I suggest, part of the benefit is what you do when you leave here. I suggest you think about your target as well, because these are two really key steps in thinking about your job. It's never too early to start. In the time you have left before you graduate, if you have some, who knows what research you can do and what you can think about. So it's always good to start. And don't feel like a target is committing you for your entire career. That's no longer true with careers, right? The idea of getting a job and you work 40 years and get your gold watch, that's long gone. You can pivot you might change your target even before you graduate, fine. But just get out and start to research something you think you'd like to do, and maybe you learn a lot about it, and by the time you are ready to look for a job, you're pretty well prepared. Maybe you change your mind and you pivot and you try to do something new, but at least you're learning something. All right. Now I'd like to pause at the 5 steps. We've only done 2, but I'd like to do something a little more interactive about exploring and reframing some of your concerns. I imagine many of you have, we could call them fears, we could call them worries, concerns, whatever word you want to use. We can actually turn these into a positive thing to help you with this search. So here's how this goes. So you can use, maybe I gave the wrong page number. I think that's for the workbook. When I do the full 2-day workshop, they have a full workbook. But you can just use the notes section at the end for this. Oh, it is page 10. So at the top, you can write down fear number 1, go down a couple lines, value, then down a couple lines, action, maybe draw a line, and do it a second time. But what you're going to do here is you're going to start by thinking about, well, what's a fear or a worry, a concern you have? Write that up here, a fear about your career. And then think, what does this mean about what's important to me? The good thing, the positive way to look at something you're worried about is, well, that's an indicator of something that really matters to you. So maybe take that seriously. That's fine. We should have things that matter. What does it say about what you value? And then that can lead you to, okay, how could you address this in your job search? What questions might you ask? How can you turn that into something where you solve that problem? You let it lead you to something that you want. So an example might be, I'm afraid I'll stagnate in industry. Okay, maybe what that means is you really value learning and growth. That's a positive thing. So maybe you could ask about mentorship and training, or maybe you ask about the work culture at the company, or maybe you do informational interviews with current employees to see what's this like. You can solve the problems and address whatever you're worried about. Or maybe you say, well, I'm worried I don't have the skills to do a good job in industry. I mean, it is a totally new environment. How do I know? Well, that's a great question. I remember being worried about that. Maybe that means that being a top performer is key to my identity. Okay, I won't blame you for that. I won't fault you for that. So maybe you ask the hiring manager, well, what would be 3 accomplishments you expect from this person that you hire in the first 6 months? I can tell you that question is probably impressive because you're thinking in terms of results, right? Somebody who comes in thinking, what do I need to do so that I make your job better in the first 6 months is a great question. Or maybe you say, oh, I'm worried about work-life balance. Can I really find that in this career? And the value is, look, my job is just one aspect of my life, and I have other things I want. Okay, great. Then you could ask about the work culture at a particular company, or you could do informational interviews with current employees. Again, the point is, fears are signals of what matter to you. So naming these and describing them actually gives you power. So take a few minutes. We'll take about 5 to 7 minutes or so. And just in your notes pages areas, in that section that you marked off there, think about what are a couple of fears you have. What does that mean you value? And what are some ideas for how you could address those? And in about 7 minutes or so, I'll let you break into groups of 2 or 3, and you can share your ideas with each other, because this can really help. You can hear somebody else that probably have a lot of the same concerns. You can hear from someone else, what are they thinking about? You might have some new ideas that really help you come out of this feeling less concerned and more empowered to make a difference and to find something that fits you. So go ahead and take about 5 to 7 minutes to write down some ideas for you. Okay, we've got about a little over 20 minutes left, so I don't want to take too long for this. The idea isn't that you have perfect ideas. I want to give you an opportunity to share with others. So go ahead and self-assemble into groups of 2, 3, 4 is fine. The number isn't so important, but just share one fear. So somebody go first. Share one fear and the value that it reveals, and then discuss ideas for evaluating that value in job roles or interviews or anything else. So the important idea is to share ideas for how do you address these. So if you want to just the group that's at your table, that's fine. Whatever works. Find a few people to get together with and walk through those. We'll take about 7 minutes or so, and then we have three other steps that we have to get through. So I promised that there were 5 steps, and we've covered only 2, so that means we have 3 left. Step number 3. Wait for people to wrap up their conversations here. But if I don't start talking, then nobody.
That was really interesting.
So step 3 is tell great stories. This sounds familiar, huh? And here's what this is all about. I talked about how do you talk to people in industry, how do you convey your value. Well, this is what it's about. But let me set it up. Imagine your next job interview or your first job interview if you haven't done one. You're trying to take your academic research experience, whatever that is, and convince an industry hiring manager you're the right person for them. Well, working in industry is very different than, research. I say science, but research in any kind. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to impress them? How do you help them see you are just the person that they need? My answer to that is tell great stories. So stories, there's a lot of benefits for stories, but they help people see what you want to see, what you want them to see. And I don't mean in a deceptive way. I just mean there's a lot of things you could do. You have a lot of skills, knowledge, attributes. But if you just relay some of these strengths, well, you don't know how they're going to connect the dots, right? You want to help them see the picture that you want them to see. Again, you're not making anything up. You're not lying. You're not exaggerating. Please don't ever. It's simply about helping them see how the facts align in the way that you believe is valuable. So let me tell you how this works. Let me give you an example in my own setting, my own situation. Now, I didn't have this workshop when I was graduating with my PhD to tell me that stories were important. I just kind of figured it out on my own because I realized, well, look, I did this physics work in laser spectroscopy, a high precision test of special relativity. I could say what was impressive to physicists, that we tested this theory to 3 parts in 10 to the 8th and showed that it is accurate to this extremely high precision, because if we ever find a gap between the theory and the data, there could be new science in there. But a company's not really going to care about that because special relativity, unless they're doing GPS or something, that's not really something they care about. And the atom interferometer was cool from a physics standpoint, but none of that had any interest in industry at the time. Now, more than 25 years later, if you've heard anything about the explosion in quantum technology for computing and cryptography, now they're starting to use a lot of this stuff in industry. But at the time, there was no application. So what was I going to say? What stories was I going to tell that I have to figure out? Well, first I need a target, right? If I'm going to tell stories, there's a lot of things I could have talked about. Yeah, I worked with lasers, I worked with vacuum chambers and a metastable neon beam and a 2-photon transition. What am I going to talk about? Depends on my audience. I decided my target would be these companies that make lasers for scientific instrumentation. They happen to be concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was convenient. From a geographical standpoint, that's the geography, right? I decided, okay, I'm willing to go work there. And if I change jobs, maybe I don't have to move. That's really great. So that's my target. So what can I tell for a story? Instead of talking about the impressive precision of the special relativity experiment, I might instead say, I'm a tunable laser systems expert. Every day I come into the lab and I get this beast, this coherent 699 dye laser up and running because it drifts overnight, the temperature changes and the mirrors misalign. I have to get it up and running as quickly as I can, better than when it was brand new, better than when the technician from the company installed it when it was brand new, right? I have to do that because the experiments that we do in our lab require the absolute highest precision of the tools. And because I have to do it consistently, I've developed a process, this is experiential knowledge, for doing it consistently fast. I can train other people in the lab on it. If your company is looking at developing the next generation of this technology, I think I have a lot I could bring because I understand what this does well and I understand what it doesn't do well. I would be really excited to help you guys develop that next generation that does so many things better. I also really understand the experiments that your customers have to do with these because that's what I've done for the last 5 years, right? I really understand I am one of your customers. I also happen to know a little bit about a few of your competitors' lasers because we have those in the lab, so you might find that interesting as well. So that's the kind of story that I told them. And I convinced them. This company, SDL, which was the story that I mentioned in the trade magazine, this company that takes really awesome badge photos, they make these tunable lasers for, this is one of the first systems that I worked on in my first job. And really interesting, about a year later, we had developed this and we were releasing it to the market. The marketing person came and said, Dave, could you put together a breadboard that we can take photos of? I'd like something that looks, to our customers, looks like a real experiment, something you might do with this. And this is part of what I had sold them on in the first place. Like, I understand what scientists, what your customers will do with these things. So I thought it was really interesting that about a year later, here I was doing something that was exactly some of the value that I decided I could bring. So you can see how that only works when you have a target. And I've actually had time to think about what can I bring? And I'm excited to do it. It's genuine excitement, right? Those are all the things that fit into that. So that is the power of a great story. We talked about skills, knowledge, and attributes. Attributes, as you might imagine, you saw the ones that I listed. I can state that. I like to see the big picture, or I like thinking about how things might be. But far more powerful would be to tell a story about a time I actually used that. So I'm actually showing them how it works. So stories have a lot of value. We could talk an awful lot about stories, but I want to move on because we have 2 more left. Step 4, build your network. The best jobs come through personal connections. I mentioned that every scientist has questions. One of the big ones or every PhD has questions. One of the big ones is, can't I just apply online and forget about networking? Does anybody wish that were the case? Think that's the case? So I get it. The online application game, that's kind of the way, it's seen as standard. There are job descriptions out there. You can upload a CV and a resume, whatever else they may ask for. That kind of is the game that a lot of people play. But if you think about your strengths, all your values, stories, that's pretty hard to convey through just uploading a resume, right? Now, we kind of know how the game is played if we think about it as a game, right? Because everything's a game. It's a game, not a formula. Companies, because it's easy to do, companies get inundated with applications, and so they have to find a way to screen through them, right? They have to figure out, how do we pick out of 100 or 1,000, how do we pick the ones that we're going to interview? You hear a lot of things about whether it's some kind of an algorithm or whether it's somebody in HR who doesn't really understand the job and is just trying to respond. Point is, it's really not a great way to convey all of your strengths. You don't really have control in that scenario. Sure, you can pick the right keywords, hopefully you write your resume just right, but you don't really even know what the filter is or who's looking at it or what they're really filtering for. So it's really a game you don't have much control over, in fact, very little control over. We have a name for games that you have no control over. What do we call those? Gambling. Exactly. And I like to say, well, the online application game, it's a lot like the lottery, where, sure, somebody's going to win, but it probably won't be you, right? And I say somebody's going to win, well, that's assuming it's a real job. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal a couple years ago now. That plum job listing may just be a ghost. I mean, there are job postings out there that nobody's actually actively interviewing for. I can't give you the percentage. I don't know the stats on that. That's pretty hard to get. But this article said they're posting jobs, but not with any intention of hiring anytime soon. First, I thought of it as an anomaly, and now I see it as a trend. It listed a whole bunch of reasons this may be the case. I think the top one here says companies always open to new people. They want to keep current employees motivated. The job was already filled. I've seen that. Somebody comes in one day and says, did you see we still have the electrical engineer opening on our website? Didn't we fill that 6 months ago? Oh, yeah, we forgot to take that down. That kind of thing happens. I mean, we're human beings, right? So that is one thing that can happen. But the other thing that I think is more relevant for PhD level people is, have you heard of the hidden job market? Not every job is posted. I've looked up some statistics, something like, I don't know, 20%. I mean, I can't vouch for these, but this is what I've read. 20% actually show up online. I think stats I saw for Germany was around 30% because I do a lot of work there. The point is, a lot of the jobs aren't advertised, and that's particularly true at a PhD level, right? I always say in the industries I work in, suppose I need a technician to solder circuit boards. That's a skills and knowledge job. I just need somebody who's certified and who can do a good job, right? Skills and knowledge, and that's all I need. I don't really need them to interact with the team, and of course I need them to be trustworthy doing that. But that's very different than a PhD researcher that I might be hiring to come in and solve complex problems, where I could just give them something that the vice president is on me for not getting done. I don't really know what the right plan is. I'd like to give it to you and say, can you please put together a plan for this? Talk to whoever you need to in the team. Come back and let's talk about what you think the best idea is, because I haven't had a chance yet. That's the kind of thing I might need from a PhD. That's a very different kind of a thing. And starting with a resume search, keywords, and all of that is really challenging. Think of the story I told of the two project managers. What I'd really like to do is to talk to somebody, or talk to a person, talk to somebody who's worked with them, talk to them somebody who knows them. That's a much better way to do it. So good managers find their employees through their network. So connecting with people is really a better way to do it. Talking to people can actually get a job where there isn't one. I did that in my last job. When I first talked to them, the manager, he was the director of engineering, he said, well, I think we need a software engineer, but this is something that just popped up yesterday, so there was certainly no job description posted anywhere, job ad posted. And now, this is the company that we put laser-based combustion sensors on great big furnaces here to try and measure their combustion properties, the oxygen, the carbon monoxide, to help them optimize combustion and minimize emissions, right? That's what we did. So he said, well, we had a board meeting yesterday, and we decided we need an app. And so that's a software engineer. I don't do coding. Software has never been a strength of mine. But instead of saying, okay, thanks, and walking away, I thought I'm going to stay in the game a little bit longer, right? Tell me a little bit about what's the problem you're trying to solve. And he said, well, we have this sophisticated laser device, and we really think it can be helpful to a lot of industries, helping them improve their combustion, minimize fuel use, minimize emissions. But the operators of these plants, they don't know what a laser spectroscopy is. They don't even have a college degree. They're just trained to run the plant. And so we install this sophisticated sensor device. They don't understand it, so they turn it off or they ignore it, and it does no good. The company doesn't want to buy another one. So the board said, this was 15 years ago or so when apps were so big. They said, you need an app. And if you get the right app, then people will use it. And so that sounds like software. So I guess that's what we need, but I haven't had a chance to think through it yet. This just happened yesterday. And I thought quickly, And I thought, well, I guess what you really need is somebody who understands the science here and understands what it can help with, but also who can get out and visit these plants and talk to the operators in a language they can understand and say, well, if you knew that the oxygen was really high in one corner or that you were creating a lot of carbon monoxide over here, what would you do? What fans would you change? What would you do? And with that, we can start to build some algorithms, some control algorithms. And then if we understand what do their current computer screens look like, we can perhaps design something that fits what they're used to. So not only will they understand it, but they'll be used to working with that kind of a thing. That sounds like that's what we need to do, but that's going to take a few months of understanding this and communicating to people who don't understand it at all. And, well, that's actually something I'm pretty good at. So they hired me. I started visiting all these plants. We put this together, and 6 months later, we hired a software engineer to code the interface, the app. Point is, this is the way real decisions are made. It's easy to imagine a company has a slot, and it's very well defined. It's got a job description and a title, and they know exactly what they need. That's not really the way things happen. It's more about something isn't getting done, and they need somebody to solve it. If it's a technician, that's very crystal clear. They know what they need, yes. Maybe that is a fine, online job search is a fine way. If you have more years of experience, you get the job. PhD level problem solver, creative, resilient person who's willing to question assumptions, that doesn't work. There are better ways to do that. So, when it comes to the online job search, be aware of the game you're playing. I'm not going to tell you don't do it, but every time you upload an application and you don't hear anything back, it erodes your confidence, it erodes your energy. Getting out and talking to people takes effort, takes creativity, but it's really a great way to start building a network that it will be good for your entire career. So, where are we? Getting right up to the end, just a few more here. So the 4 steps we talked about: determine your strengths, define your target, tell great stories, and build your network. These are all things you can do. You can action them, right? The last step is more inspirational. It's think big. Don't limit yourself by other people's beliefs. Have the courage to create your own path. As a PhD, you will get a lot of input on what you can do and what you can't do. So I've gone through, now I realize, so I've worked for 4 different companies doing very different things. Big companies, 30,000 people. Small companies, 20 people. I traveled like 40 states and 20 countries just with work alone. Worked with all these different companies. I never imagined I'd be sitting in a meeting with somebody from Apple. I remember that day I thought, wow, okay, I had no idea I could do this as a PhD scientist. Now I've started my own business. I've written 3 books. I look back at this guy who was there in the lab working on my PhD, and I realize I had no idea what the potential was out there. So I encourage you to think big. And don't listen too much to the naysayers. Has anybody read this book? It's an interesting book. It's got a very catchy title. It's a good book, but the article, or the quote that I like from it is, when somebody says you can't do something, what they're really saying is they can't do it. It's kind of an important part of human psychology. It's real easy for someone to, maybe they didn't want to try it themselves, or they were afraid to try it, say, oh, you can't do that. A lot of times what they're communicating is, well, I would never do that. That doesn't mean you can't. Right? So have the courage to create your own path. This is part of the game. You have to take a risk. Be willing to take a risk. So many different things you might be able to do out there, and that we could talk about. And if you're considering a career outside of academia or research, it may feel like stepping away from everything you've built. But what if you're not leaving anything? What if you're actually expanding? Expanding how people see your skills, expanding the impact, the way you can make a difference. Career in industry is absolutely not the end of your identity as a researcher or PhD, scientist if you think of yourself as a scientist, right? It's really an opportunity to express it in a new way. You solve problems. Industry has a lot of problems, so let's get you together. We talked about these 5 strengths, these 5 steps. Determine your strengths, define your target, tell great stories, build your network, and think big. So I do encourage you to do the worksheet for determine your strengths and define your target after you leave here. It really will be a great step and help you in the time you have left before you graduate. If you want to talk more about stories or about build your network or even about how to think big about the options that are out there, there are things that I'd be happy to come back a 5th time and talk more about that. So happy to come back and do that. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Either you can just search my name or you can scan the QR code. And this is the book. This is my second book. It's a game, not a formula. The QR code will take you to where you can find that in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook, read by me. This is actually goes into a lot more depth in how does industry think and function? What are the rules? What's your playbook for succeeding? And before everyone leaves, I actually have two here, and I want to give them away. I know you'd like it. I hope you win, but I can't control that. So if you look under your chairs, there are two chairs that have a sticky underneath them that say winner. Yeah, if you look at that front solid part, right, there's the mesh, but if you look on the... I like that, yes. All right, awesome. You are a winner. And it's a signed one. I signed it. One more out here somewhere. Must be one chair that we haven't checked yet.
Can I call dibs? Take a risk, win big?
I really admire the initiative there. That's a great idea. Wow, still haven't found it, huh?
Someone's looking. Someone's close.
Okay, somebody's warm. Oh, hey, there you go. Awesome. There you go. You're welcome. All right. And with that, that takes us to the end. Kind of a lot compressed into 90 minutes. I hope you got some value out of this. You absolutely are valued in industry. Don't listen to people who say you're overqualified. It's all about looking in the right way. That's why these 5 steps are important. You have valuable strengths. Make sure you're aware of what they are. Have a target, because only then can you help them see the value. Stories are a great way to convey what you're really good at. Talk to people. That's the best way. I know it takes work, creativity, but creativity is worth a lot. I've got lots of stories of, talking to the right person. You were good at describing what you did briefly, succinctly, and that made a connection. That's the way real careers are built. Lots of us have done it. You can do it too, even without industry experience, right? That's the thing. I know you hear job descriptions that say, we want 3 years of industry experience, but everybody who's working out there got their first job without any industry experience. So clearly that's not an essential requirement. All right. You are free to go. Happy to hang on if anyone has questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.